So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. This is our fifth MRD Talk, How Can Monitoring Support Action and Policies for Sustainable Futures in Mountains? MRD Talks are science policy dialogues that are conducted by the editorial team of the journal Mountain Research and Development, and they are part of the project PRIMA, Promoting Innovations in Mountain Areas, which is led by UNEP and funded by the Austrian Development Agency. Next slide, please. So today we would like to discuss about monitoring and observatories and how these can support actions and policies for more sustainable futures in mountains. Monitoring can be defined in different ways. Here I will use a definition provided by the Mountain Observatories Working Group, that's MRI, as the integrated and systematic observation of interactions among people, ecosystems, and environments within mountain systems and between mountains and other systems. Monitoring activities can be used to quantify signals of change and thus help us to understand dynamics, be it socio-economic, environmental, and others in mountain systems. They should be delivered rapidly and ideally in near real time. And why are they important? Because they are key to understanding and supporting actions that aim to address development and livelihood challenges, but also to identify opportunities for innovations on a scientifically supported basis. So today, what we would like to do with our panelists from different parts of the world and together with you, our participants, is to jointly explore and learn from successful monitoring initiatives. We want to also discuss how best to set up monitoring systems and share the information obtained in order to enable effective policies and action for sustainable futures in mountains. Next slide, please. Our talk will be organized in two parts. The first hour or so, a bit less than an hour, will be dedicated to listen to several studies and initiatives. And we have 4 panelists from different parts of the world who are joining us. First, Julieta Carrilla will make a presentation, The Way Forward for Long-Term Social-Ecological Monitoring in the Andes. And she will share the insights from a study that was published in our journal, in MRD, recently. Then we have Valentin Valneuffer, who will share experiences and initiatives in South Tyrol on tourism observatories and their impact on sustainability transformations. Fourth, we will have a presentation by Birendra Bhattacharya on forest fire detection and monitoring in Nepal. And lastly, a presentation by James Thornton on the global initiatives, Joe Mountains, and how it can support action and policy. So this will be the first hour of the talk, and the the last half an hour of the talk will be dedicated to a more interactive format where we will use mural, and we hope to have a lively discussion and interaction also with you participants. Next slide. So before we start and we dive into the presentations, we have a very short question for you. In your view, what aspects should be monitored or measured in mountains to guide action and policies for sustainable futures in mountains? So you can click on the Mentimeter link that should appear in the chat. And there you can enter either one or more keywords to answer a question. So we can already see here that we have a very diverse set of aspects which should be monitored, from more environmental aspects, such as, of course, biodiversity, climate change, degradation, erosion, etc., but also demographic aspects, age structure, employment, and others, and other socio-economic dimensions, tourism, transhumance practices, etc. So we can already imagine from these responses that it is quite challenging to set up systems, monitoring systems, which can account for all of these indicators in an integrated way. Thank you very much. So after this very short introduction, I would like to invite our first panelist, Julieta Carrilla, who is a researcher at CONICET in Yerba Buena, Argentina, and at the Instituto excuse me, de Ecología Regional, sorry, Julieta, at the University of Tucumán in Argentina. So welcome, Julieta.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Sarah Lance, Susan, and all the colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting and nice space to share my studies. And I will present this study that we conducted with a group of researchers from the Andes, from CONICET, Argentina, and CONDESANT. And this is the way forward for long-term socio-ecological monitoring in the Andes. Why we are interested in studying Andean socio-ecological system? Why are they important? They sustain the livelihood of millions of people, and also they maintain one of the most diverse region of the planet, and why they provide ecosystem services. Due to its steep gradient and the wide spatio-temporal variability of the Andes, they are particularly vulnerable to environmental change. So we need to understand what are the effects and the essential factors that characterize and differentiate them to make them more resilient to these changes. So despite all this importance of the Andes, there is still little evidence of the integration of the social and the environmental dimensions to understand the long-term changes that are occurring at continental scales. So we think that the integration of the long-term social and environmental monitoring is key to understand processes of local configuration of cells and to support policy for sustainable mode. So the objective of our study was divided mainly in three parts. One was develop an Andean long-term monitoring model, then to assess this model, the consistency of this model with existing monitoring efforts, and finally to identify priorities for designing a research agenda to understand Andean's response to climate and land use change. So to analyze the current status of monitoring in the Andes, we developed this long-term monitoring that through different sources of information. One was a survey, literature search, and compilation of active networks. And we got 239 records related to monitoring efforts in the Andes. These maps shows the spatialization of these records, and we can highlight here that climate and hydrology and vegetation and disturbances are the main monitoring effort that exists in the Andes, while, for example, the social monitoring was underrepresented, or at least we couldn't capture by it completely. This is a very simple conceptual model which describes the processes of knowledge generation of the dynamics of the Andean SES, also the interaction between the stakeholders that are involved in this in knowledge generation, in the implementation, and in the management of the social ecological systems in the Andes. This model was done with the discussion of two virtual meetings with experts. This model is present 4 elements. One is the social ecological system that by itself is our single, we consider it as a single unit of analysis, is the green part in the middle of the model. We also have the stakeholders or actors that are involved in the implementation of the Andean SES. One is the academy, which includes all the scientists, and which are we usually describe and quantify the Andean SES. The other is the community. The community is another actor involved in the implementation and management of the Andean SES. However, the community usually is the one who asks for information and for monitoring for their own quality of life, to improve their quality of life and where they're living. And the government is another actor of our model, which usually use the information analyzed by the academia for the management of the SES. So we also had another element, which are the external factors, which are in green, the external and the internal factors, which are in green, for example, climate change, international legislation that had an impact over our social ecological systems. And the arrows, the red arrow, represent the interaction between the elements of the model. In our study, we feed these arrows. The white of the arrows represent the number of records that we find in our database in the research of the monitoring efforts related to that particular interaction. For example, we can see here the disproportion between the monitoring related to the biophysical versus the social dimensions that are most conducted by the academy. We also can highlight here that the co-production of knowledge, this is the implementation, the generation of knowledge and the management of the Andean socio-ecological systems is quite scarce or underrepresented. We can see here also the participatory monitoring is like coming more important nowadays, because community are taking their own manage or monitoring to manage their own natural resources. That's the need they have. And regarding the external factors, we can see that most of the monitoring that we find, the existing monitoring, are related to climate change. Well, we can see here, the research priority we identified was classified in 4 categories. The first category was the characterization and the functioning of the social ecological system. This considered as the stakeholders, economic activities, the ecological elements, and their interaction should form the basis for analytical classification. One example of this is the social ecological land systems of this publication from Sarva and collaborations, which are typologies of different regions based on several variables and dimensions. And our aim is to, based on this classification, do something rescaled to the Andes. Another important priority for the integrated monitoring of Andean SES is the influence of external dynamics. This, our research shows that the most external dynamic that had been conducted is the climate change, but we need to be monitoring global drivers of change in general. We thought that long-term monitoring should provide information to global agreement and legislation. And one example of this is, for example, what happened with the demand of natural resources that are produced in the Andes, and with the demand of places far from the Andes, for example, the Lichon International Market. Another priority is the information accessibility. The growing availability of data and information will strengthen research networks, foster knowledge co-production, support science policy dialogue, and facilitate science-based governance. One example of this are the biodiversity networks that can accumulate a very big database of information. I put here Gloria, the network that I am familiar with it. And finally, not the last important, very important is the governance. The effect of policies and management strategies should, through long-term monitor and the implementation of participatory research. We think that the coordination of long-term monitoring is in observatories, including multiple stakeholders. One example of this is this region, the Chocó Andino in Ecuador, which is a mountain area, forest mountain area, which is implemented and management and also the generation of knowledge is conducted by the different stakeholders that are involved in this region. One consequence we can say of this study was the creation in this year of the Andean social-ecological observatories. We call ROSA because it's acronym in Spanish. That all these the objectives of this network are aligned with the research priorities and gaps that we identify in our study. And I highlight some objectives that are also associated with the main objective or idea of these talks, which is the support of policies and actions for a sustainable mountain. And for example, one of these is the need to integrate the social-ecological monitoring to the territorial management and governance. Well, some recommendations that derive from these studies that long-term monitoring of cells should integrate social, economic, as well as the biophysical dimensions in order to improve the understanding of the sex functioning and the external influence of cells, also to access to information for policymakers and society, and support knowledge-based decision-making for effective governance through adequate communication. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Julieta, for this very interesting talk. We can now take one or two questions from the audience. If you have very specific questions for Julieta, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the second part of the talk, we will have the opportunity to have a broader discussion with the participants. But if you have a very specific question to Julieta, please enter it into the chat. And if not, that means that your presentation was crystal clear. And we will take again the discussion, especially regarding your recommendations in the second part of the talk. Thank you, Julieta. I would like now to invite our second panelist, Valentin Valneufer, who is a researcher at the Center for Advanced Studies at URAC in Bolzano, Italy. Valentin, can you please share your screen?
So thank you, Sarah. And hello also from my side. My name is Valentin, and I'm presenting to you an example of an observatory about sustainable tourism in the Italian region of South Tyrol. And our observatory is part of an international network of tourism observatories. It is founded by the United Nations World Tourism Organization, and it was founded already almost 20 years ago. And right now there are about 38 observatories all around the world. And we have some common guidelines that we are working on. So we have, for example, 11 common issue areas that all of us have to monitor on a yearly basis. But the indicators within those issue areas can vary from observatory to observatory, so based on the local context. And then we have some other differences as well. For example, the governance style of the observatories can differ a lot, or also other aspects. And our observatory is the Sustainable Tourism Observatory of South Tyrol. It was founded in 2018, and it is based at the Center for Advanced Studies of URAC Research. So we are research institutions, and all of us, me and my colleagues that are working on this, are researchers mainly from social sciences. But we have a partnership with the destination management organization of our region, IDM, and they have a good collaboration with the private tourism industry. And then we're also partly funded by the provincial government. So we also have a good relationship to them. And next to those local stakeholders, we are part of this international network that I already explained. And we have very diverse stakeholders in the region. So we have the university, the statistical office, other public and private institutions that collaborate with us. And as objectives for our observatory, we defined two major points. So first of all, we are, of course, researchers. So we would like to offer a theoretical contribution to the conceptualization of sustainable tourism. But then a major goal is, of course, also to support the tourism industry and the government in developing policies and strategies for sustainable tourism development, and to support this process of evidence-based policymaking. And in order to achieve those objectives, we have three main activities. So first of all, we have the monitoring activities, of course. So right now we monitor 31 indicators in 15 issue areas and in 3 different dimensions. You can see them on the right. So we monitor, for example, the environmental impact of tourism in South Tyrol, and we have indicators regarding energy management, water use, waste generation. Then we have some more classical economic indicators about employment or seasonality, for example. And then we also monitor some cultural and social aspects of tourism. For example, we monitor the local satisfaction with the tourism development. And so we do this monitoring on a yearly basis, and we write down our results in an annual report. So the reporting is the second big part of our activities. This report is provided to the World Tourism Organization, but it's also publicly available and shared with all of our stakeholders. And then we also do some scientific publications on specific topics, or we do transfer-oriented publications for our stakeholders. And then, of course, we also have a website where we try to keep all of those indicators up to date and make them easily accessible for everyone. And another big part of our activities are the networking activities. So we have, for example, lots of meetings and presentations to local stakeholders. We also organize events for them. For example, now in October or November, we will have this event about transformation tourism in South Tyrol with hotels as the target group. So we want to show them our work, but also sustainable business models, for example. Then we have the exchange with international observatories, but also presentations at international conferences. And like this, we can also constantly discuss our work with, get other experiences and improve our work. And then we also try to support local projects in the province that are done by other organizations or stakeholders. So for example, there is a sustainability award of the Fiera in Bolzano, and we help them defining the evaluation criteria. So we also try to collaborate with different projects that have something to do with sustainable tourism in South Tyrol. And with all of those networking activities, we try to have an impact on the tourism stakeholders. We try to raise awareness for specific topics for sustainability in tourism. And next to that, we can also provide a few examples of concrete ways how we impacted tourism development in our region. So the most important example is the Regional Tourism Development Program. So as I said, we have a good collaboration with the province. So our work, our indicators was the scientific basis for the Regional Tourism Development Program. We used our indicators to show the status quo of tourism in South Tyrol, but then we also collaborated and did other methods to develop a future scenario for tourism, and we also included our indicators there. And this was then used by the government to make the tourism development program and to do policies. And then another concrete example is the sustainability program Tourism South Tyrol, which is done by the local DMO, by the Destination Management Organization, IDM. So they right now they try to increase sustainability certification in destinations and in hotels. And we give them scientific support and consulting. And for example, we developed a questionnaire that was distributed in the destinations to ask about local satisfaction to tourism, because this is also a part of the sustainability certification process. Yeah, and then I had a talk to my colleagues who have more experience in this observatory, and together we try to define some recommendations for monitoring systems. So one important part for us is the involvement in a diverse stakeholder network. As I said, we are a research institutions, but we have a good collaboration with the private sector through this destination management organization, but also with the government. And that is, of course, why we can impact them, we can collaborate with them, and they have an interest in us, in our work. Then in the beginning, it's of course very important to build up recognition and visibility and trust, so that people in the province also get to know the observatory. And then when developing the indicators, it was important to include local knowledge of different local stakeholders. It is also important to constantly reevaluate and refine our indicators, so not just stay with those that were defined in the beginning, but we try to constantly look on what can be done what can be improved. And then something that we are trying to work on right now, that we also find quite important, is the transmission of results through targeted communication formats. So as I said, we have this yearly report that we provide, but it's of course very long and quite heavy, and it's not the best way to give the information to every stakeholder. So right now we try to develop more targeted communication formats for different target groups and different stakeholders. That's it. I put down my email address and our website in case you have any questions or you want to have a look. And thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Valentin, for this very good example of how a monitoring system can feed directly into policymaking in the field of sustainable tourism. Here again, we can take one or two specific questions for Valentin, if there are some regarding his presentation, sorry. Please enter your question in the chat. And if there are none, we will now go to the Himalayas after the Andes and the European Alps. And I would like to invite our fourth presenter, Virendra Bhattacharya, who is Chief of Party for Surveyor in the Kush Himalaya at ICIMOD in Nepal. And he will present us with a different case of monitoring system for forest fire management in Nepal. Virendra, could you please share your screen?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be presenting on the forest fire detection and monitoring case from Nepal. Although ICIMOD, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, where I work, is a regional intergovernmental organization working in 8 countries, spanning from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, China, and India. But again, this case is mainly from Nepal. So forest fire has been a challenging issue for Nepal, mainly for the forest sector. And if you look at historical data, we can clearly see that there has been a large number of forest fires every year, and we see this cycle is repeating every couple of years' time. And even this year, we saw quite a bit of forest fire, which brings a lot of impact in terms of air pollution, the visibility problem, and so on. And also looking at the historical data on the monthly fire occurrences, we can clearly see that the forest fire starts in February, March, and then it reaches a peak in April. So every month, every year, April is the peak for forest fires in Nepal, which slowly gets subdued after the start of monsoon in June. So the forest fire monitoring and system for Nepal was developed jointly with Department of Forest and Soil Conservation in Nepal. And we see this has not been developed in one time, but again, it has evolved over time. The first monitoring system we started was back in 2013, where we started getting the data from Modi's fire information and then developed an alert system. And then slowly, based on the demand, we also try to do some assessment of the study data to come up with the areas which are more at risk from forest fires. And then finally, the recent development was on producing fire hazard outlook to give a kind of forecast on the areas that are at high risk on forest fire. So I'll be going step by step on these three approaches which evolve over time. The Modi's active fire data was, the system was started back in 2013, where we had a Modi's receiving station installed at EC mode. And then from there, as soon as we got the data from Modi's satellite pass, we used to clip those data with the country boundary and then overlay with the forest mask, and then also look into various district and administrative boundaries. And then we used to send the information through SMS notification to those relevant district forest officers, as well as the community forest user groups. At the same time, the email notification used to go to all the registered participants. And also, a website shows the forest fire information. And this is also published in one of our recent book on the Earth observation on science applications for risk reduction and enhanced resilience in the edge region. So this is an example where the fire information is sent through email as a list of tables, and also the users can click on the link to produce a map, as well as also the web example of the web, where they can interactively query the fire data. So as we moved on, we also found that the damage assessment was not very useful using the satellite data. So we also built a model where the users can report the damage using the standard forms developed by the department, so that they can also report the damage and the fire incidences, which also are loaded in our database and can be available for the users to query. And moving forward, looking into the historical data, we also thought that it would be good to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of the forest fire, so that we can come up with the risk areas. So we came up with a methodology where we did analysis using land cover, summer land surface temperature, distance from settlement, distance from road, elevation, slope, and those kind of parameters. As the forest fire in Nepal is mainly caused by anthropogenic reasons, distance to settlements, distance to road also plays a very important role. So we came up with those district information, which are at high risk of forest fire, which was also used by the community forestries for their campaigning and their mitigation plans. Then, as we looked into the possibility of coming up with early warning, so we have a system called high impact weather assessment tool installed at EC mode through the survey program for over the last 5-6 years, and this gives the weather forecast using the ensemble numerical weather forecasting. So we found that the outputs of this system can also be used to develop the fire weather index, which integrates temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and rainfall, so that we can come up with the areas which are at potential hazard for wildfire. So this data is updated every day for 2 days. And then this is the kind of map we get with the high, low, and moderate areas of fire risk. And then what we did was every next day, we try to overlay with the fire points. And we found a very good pattern of the actual fire areas and also the outlook that we prepare every day. So this system we find can be very helpful in terms of understanding the spatial and temporal pattern of the forest fires in Nepal. And also important part is getting the spatially disaggregated information so that we can take preventive measures. So the municipalities or the districts which are shown with the high probability can be alerted on time. And if people can use this information and share with relevant agencies, they can take early actions or can be preparatory measures to prevent the fires. Now, coming to the recommendations, what I found is the communication channels is very important. So mainly the forest offices, network of CFGs, local radios, they can be very effective in terms of communicating with the local communities so that the timely information is disseminated for alerts as well as for awareness. However, we also found that allocation of resources is quite important because although they are aware that there's going to be fire or they're at fire risk, but they don't have infrastructure or organizational setup to really cope with those fire events. And another important part is coordination, because we see that Indian Army or the Forest Department or CFGs, coordination among them is quite important, as well as the first responders like the armed police forces or the army and police. They're the ones who are mobilized when there's a fire. So coordination among all these different groups is quite important for effective mitigation and fighting with the fire. And another important part is the collaboration with the global and regional initiatives. Some of the examples I've shown here is due to the collaboration with the global research teams that made it possible for us to come up with these tools. So this collaboration is always important for knowledge sharing and adopting those technologies, customizing them as per the need of the region. So we need to look into all these different aspects for better managing the environment, for better monitoring the fires and those hazards. So here, I would like to stop here and then thank you all for listening. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Virendra. That was very clear and I think pretty obvious to everyone how important can these not only monitoring but actually outlook system be for mountain areas. Is there a specific question from the audience for our panelists? If so, please enter them into the chat. And if there weren't any, thank you again, Virendra. I will now invite our fourth and last panelist, James Thornton, who is a senior scientific project officer at the Mountain Research Initiative based in Bern, Switzerland, and who will tell us about GeoMountains, which is a global initiative. The floor is yours, James.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah Lan and your colleagues at MRD for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you today. So GeoMountains is the global network for observations and information in mountain environments. It's an initiative of the Group on Earth Observations, GEO, which is a partnership of over 100 governments and a further 100 participating organizations. And we're really working to increase the discoverability and accessibility of a wide range of data and information pertaining to mountain environments globally. By this, I mean improving the ease with which members of our community, our stakeholders, can find and obtain these data. Then we're trying to combine the data and apply it to address key scientific, practical, and policy-related challenges or questions. And more generally, we're trying to build a very coherent, collaborative community across these different regions and disciplines, taking very much a systems approach. So in this short talk, turning our attention to the topic today, much of our work around trying to contribute to effective policies and actions in relation to mountain development, sustainable mountain development, is focused on the translation process, or packaging, or linking the scientific and research information, and putting that in formats and messages which are suitable and digestible for policy and action. So in this short talk, I'll just give you a few examples from across our work program of some of these activities. And just to mention, of course, that we have several other activities which are focused more on other stakeholders, for instance, the research community or teachers and educators and learners as well. So the first activity is around trying to shed some light upon the coverage of existing in situ or ground monitoring across a range of different disciplines. And the rationale here is that a lot of the monitoring which is conducted across the world's mountains is done so by the research community rather than by the operational agencies from the respective governments. And as a result, there are many, many different groups doing things in slightly different ways. And it's very complex to get an overview of simply who is measuring what, why, when, where, and how. And so this could have some adverse consequences: duplication or redundancy, inefficiency, potential collaborations which could be developed but which are not. And so in this respect, we sought to develop this in situ inventory which tries to show all of the locations on the map with some key metadata about who's responsible for these sites, and hopefully with links to the data where available. And so the key policy relevant messages from this work so far, it's of course an ongoing effort, and we hope to integrate some of the observatories which we've heard also from the other speakers as well. But so far, we can certainly say that there's actually quite a considerable amount of monitoring infrastructure installed in the world's mountains. That should read more than 50,000 sites, not less than. And this is kind of somewhat contrary to popular belief that mountains are somehow very poorly monitored. However, we still don't necessarily have very comprehensive metadata on all of these sites. So exactly what variables are being measured, at what frequencies, using what instrumentation, over what periods, and so on. And indeed, furthermore, it's not always the case that the corresponding data themselves, the actual observations, are available. And so if these last two aspects can be addressed, then we'll really help fulfill this crucial prerequisite for more effective policy and action in relation to mountain climate change adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development more generally, because these local observations are really the foundation of all of that. Secondly, we also try to develop perspective articles or scientific research publications in the peer-reviewed literature, but which have very applied or very strong policy relevant messages or angles. And so I give 3 examples here, and we'll just briefly take a look through a couple of those key messages from each in turn. On the first one, we've really conducted quite a bit of work of bringing together experts from across different disciplines to try to help develop this consensus about, given the limited resources which we have for monitoring, where should we really focus these efforts? Which variables should be prioritized for monitoring in a consistent fashion, and how should those variables be monitored? So what kind of spatial resolution is required, or what kind of uncertainty is acceptable in order to help develop some meaningful insights for policy and action. So in particular, we need some standardized protocols which we can apply consistently across regions to enable us to report on the respective trends, for example, in different regions, in global assessments like the IPCC reports, which of course will then help hopefully feed through to policy. A couple of specific examples could be that we need to use consistent techniques for measuring mountain precipitation at sufficient spatial and temporal resolution with sufficient accuracy. This is of course a crucial variable for many applications related to water availability, local natural hazards, but is actually something which is very difficult to measure, perhaps surprisingly, especially in snowy and windy conditions. And there are many, many different ways to do that with various correction factors. But this means that the data may not necessarily be very intercomparable and policy relevant afterwards. Likewise, using perhaps consistent data sets and algorithms to quantify changes in snow coverage patterns. The third example, I just wanted to bring this example to really underline the importance of open science when we're talking about translating science to policy and action. Really, it's very crucial that decision makers understand the sensitivity of the information we are giving them to perhaps different methodological choices or different data choices. And so, for example, I just show this plot from a study which we did a couple of years ago now. We're looking at the dynamics of human populations in mountains and how they are associated with trends in urbanization. And from the graph, essentially, you can see that in many mountain regions, we've seen this very strong increase in population over a 40-year period. And in many regions, this has also been associated with strong trends in urbanization. But in some regions, that's not the case. In particular, in certain regions, we've seen this strong population growth, but actually this has remained rather rural. So, of course, these two different situations should elicit very different policy responses. And yeah, really, some of this work could then be useful for helping to develop improved future projections of population dynamics, not only under future climate change scenarios, but also demographic scenarios as well, and to ensure that our policies are proportionate and effective. The last aspect I wanted to touch upon is, again, how we present this information in the form of documentation or other media, such that it is useful for decision makers. So again, a couple of recent examples of our work are illustrated here. As with everything else I've presented today, this is accessible via the GEO Mountains website as well. But the figure on the left there was just the cover of a policy brief which we put together to help explain where mountain data comes from, basically, what different techniques we can use to obtain data, what the respective strengths and limitations are, so that decision makers can have this sort of in the back of their mind when they're using those data and information, so they can appreciate some of the uncertainties and limitations and can hopefully interpret everything correctly. And the second example was this series of mountain range fact booklets, which we've developed and recently released for 100 global mountain ranges, which provide a whole set of graphs and figures and metrics on multiple themes in a rather intercomparable way. So again, there's just a couple of examples here from the European Alps and from the Hindu Kush. And we see, for example, in terms of the demographics, that even though the populations of these two mountain ranges were rather similar in the year 2015, of course, the trajectories are rather different. And you know, such comparisons can be made for many of the different indicators which we present in these fact booklets, to really enable the systems thinking and effective actions. So in terms of my conclusions or recommendations in conclusion, certainly this data consistency and intercomparability is key when we're talking about policy on a sort of regional or global level. Of course, scientists often need very specific data, very, very high resolution for their specific studies. And that's, of course, crucial on the one hand, but we also need to be developing data sets which are intercomparable. So we have to work on these two streams, really, in a given region. Of course, the data need to be freely shared to the greatest extent possible, and as well as being findable and accessible. There's no point in doing monitoring if not everybody who could benefit from it is able to. We need good metadata and consistent formats of data. So it's kind of the boring side of the job, but it's really, really crucial that users can pick up and understand what the observations are, how they were collected, and how they can be used, and equally what they should not be used for. And similarly to that, really this transparency, reproducibility, open science is really important so that society can trust the science and can gain a full appreciation of the strengths and limitations of the information which, as scientists, we deliver. And in particular, as we've heard in a couple of examples already, we need to try to readdress the balance from the biophysical sciences by further emphasizing socioeconomic data monitoring, collection, systemization of socioeconomic data. And I just wanted to mention that Geo Mountains has a task group on this, and my colleague Jess Dells from URAC Research is here as well today, and so she may have some reflections on this during the discussion, but just to say that everybody is welcome to contribute to this community effort. And with that, I would just like to thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, James. That was very interesting to learn about all these activities. Is there a specific question from the audience regarding this presentation? If you do, please enter it into the chat. And if not, we would like now to take you to the second part of our talk, where we would like to discuss with you, with the panelists and with the audience, and try to jointly explore how can monitoring support action and policies for sustainable futures in mountains. We want to look at, on the one hand, what we already do well, and on the other hand, what should be improved. We will share a link into the chat to a mural, but before that, I would like to explain to you a little bit the dynamics. So as you saw from these 4 very interesting presentations, we got a wealth of recommendations from the panelists. And we clustered all of these recommendations into 4 topics. So here you can see, you should see the mural that we've prepared. On the top left, we have listed the recommendations that relate to data and knowledge. Then here, data and knowledge. What you can see in the blue sticky notes, the recommendations from the panelists. Then on the lower left corner, we have clustered the recommendations that relate more specifically to accessibility, access to information. Then on the top right, we have clustered the recommendations that relate to competences and resources. And finally, on the bottom right corner, those that relate to communication and learning. So in the blue sticky notes, you see the recommendations by our 4 panelists. The exercise is quite simple. We would like you to reflect on the one hand, what we are already doing well. And for that, you can use any of the green sticky notes. And then on the other hand, that you could think of what needs to be improved. And there we would ask you to use a yellow sticky note. The instructions, you will find them again on the top of the mural. You can just take with your mouse on one of the sticky notes and just drop it into any of the area and just double click on it and write down your ideas. Please do not make long sentences, but more key ideas. You do not need to respond to all of these topics. Please focus on those where you have more experience or that you find more interesting or appealing to you. And we will have a few minutes to do this exercise before we invite again our panelists to comment on your contributions. So I hope that everything is clear. You should be able to access the Zoom by clicking on the link which is provided in the chat. If for some reason that doesn't work for you, you can also write your input into the chat and we will be happy to copy them for you. Thank you.
Saralan, I see that Daphna Urbach has a question or raised a hand.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I unfortunately need to leave the call, which is really unfortunate since monitoring is very close to my heart. Thank you very much for all the 4 inputs. Just to one point that I would like to raise, it's the notion of adaptive monitoring, which I've been missing badly during this series of presentation. I think we really need to pitch the whole discussion around monitoring into a framework of adaptive changes that also need to then be adopted within the management that comes out of the monitoring. As the world in which we're living is changing, the requirements for transformations are changing constantly, and we can't just keep doing the monitoring we're doing in a static way. And with that, I'll wish you a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important contribution. Bye-bye, Davna. Well, thank you very much for all these very interesting ideas, which I've been following on Mural. May I please ask you now to exit Mural to get back to our Zoom room, as Susan will help us by sharing the Mural so that we can all look at the same dimension together. And we would first like to discuss about data and knowledge. If you please zoom in, Susan. Perfect. Thank you. And I would like now to invite Julieta, if you want, Julieta, sorry, if you want to comment, make a comment about some of these contributions and recommendations. Julieta.
Yes. Well, apart from what I mentioned of the recommendations, we have 4 more thoughts of the audience that we can, what we can do to improve the data and knowledge management. So one of these is that increased balance in global representativity in global database. I don't know if I have to do some reflection of each of the.
So Julieta, you're welcome to either briefly present them or just choose one of them, or even mention something that you think is missing. You're quite free to use a few minutes to comment. Okay.
Well, I will continue reading on. Adapting monitoring, a restoration of socio-ecosystems, develop a consensuate or agreement for methods of basic and global strategy for integrate social, economic, and biophysical dimension. Well, and things that I wrote, I think related to data and knowledge, but also it's very linked with the information accessibility, of course, because it's very associated. The knowledge, you create the knowledge so you can transfer to the people or to different stakeholders. And I think it's very important to use good sensible indicators, to use formats that are understandable and easily to use for determinant stakeholders. Also, it's important to transfer this knowledge through transparency and trustable, and should be comparably. That means that we need to use similar scales, or to try to put in a similar scale, or trying to compare in different scale, but consistently, like local, regional, continental, the different monitoring, and using protocols, standardized protocols should be good, something to apply. And another thing that I was talking with Petra is that it's important to generate this data and this knowledge to have maybe some local or small questions so we can answer from the local scales to the more regional or continental scale. So to have a method and a question that go from the local to the regional or continental.
Well, thank you very much, Julieta. And we saw that this importance of consistency, comparability, integration was also highlighted by James in his presentation. I don't know if from the audience, does someone still want to add a thought or something regarding the question of data and knowledge? If so, please either raise your hand or mention it in the chat. I think raising your hand would be easier. If not, I think that Julieta, you also mentioned the question of accessibility and dissemination. And this brings us to our second topic, if we can go to the bottom left. And here I would like to invite James to provide a brief comment on the inputs from the participants.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the participants. I think there's a couple of interesting points here, which I'll just pick out and reflect on. One, I think, is this need for a common database or main platform. I certainly have the impression that something which is really challenging for the community, whether they be researchers or policymakers, is just the many hundreds or thousands of different ways and places to access data. And so one of the things which we are trying to do in GeoMountains is somehow build a kind of super inventory of all these different data portals. This is our general inventory, which may help in the longer term. If we go to full interoperability, then we can essentially have a federated data approach where there's data sets sitting in different locations, but which can be accessed and updated in real time across and accessed in many different ways from different nodes or systems. I think this is something to look to in the future. Governmental initiative to promote open source standards. This, I think, is really important as well. It's a great point because most of the science is funded at the end of the day by taxpayers. But unless there's these strong requirements from funding agencies, but also from scientific publishers for open science, which is to say that all of the methods and code and data to support a particular study is made openly available and freely usable, then there's a breakdown in the system, really. So I think it would be great if governments got together, as they have started to do in certain countries, and say that any science which we fund has to be open, full stop. Of course, there can be some certain exceptions for very sensitive data, personal data, and so on. But for general environmental data, societal data, aggregated, I think that would be useful. And then the remaining 3 points really touch on this communication aspect, which is how do we use language and terminology and present only relevant information. I would fully agree with these points as well, that we need to also work, for example, with communication experts, and we shouldn't necessarily expect scientists to take on all of this work in terms of doing the science, but also engaging with the local stakeholders and communicating to a broader audience, because sometimes there are very different skills which are needed to do that. So maybe there's not enough people also playing a role on this science policy interface to help this process. That's just a personal reflection which I have, given the number of scientists we have, but relative to the number of people playing this intermediary role. And I was wondering if Jess would have any reflections in particular on the social and economic data about access to this kind of information, or if not, if any of the other participants have any reflections.
So please go ahead and raise your hand if you want to answer to James' question or add something on these points. Jess,
can I? Yeah, thank you, James, as well for providing me with the segue to to mention which you already did, the task group 2.3 on the identifying essential socioeconomic variables to be monitored in mountains. And in terms of access to information, I would like to talk to Valentin after about how exactly the indicators that were used in the tourism monitoring were identified, because this is a real issue that we are having to find, to identify variables that are locally relevant, but at the same time globally intercomparable, because we're looking to identify variables for mountain regions across the world. But of course, this is when thinking about the relevance for scientists in specific areas looking for data to understand change in their mountains. It's not necessarily going to be indicators that are relevant for everyone. And so this, in case anyone has also some inputs for that, I would be very happy to discuss with you about that as well. You can contact James and he'll put us in contact. If anyone has an experience on this kind of issue, specifically with socioeconomic variables, then please reach out to us.
Valentin, I don't know if you want to answer to that question.
Yeah, I can maybe say
Briefly.
something about it. So I was not involved in the observatory from the beginning on, but I know that my colleagues did some kind of, so they did interviews with local stakeholders of the tourism industry. I don't know if they did maybe even a Delphi analysis and try to identify what indicators are important to the tourism stakeholders. So because an important goal of our work is to have an impact on the local stakeholders also. So it was important from the beginning on to include their views. And from the guidelines of the United Nations World Tourism Organizations, it's more important to have local specific indicators in our case than to have indicators that are internationally comparable. This is also why they did not define common indicators that have to be measured by every observatory, but just common issue areas where people should work on, but the indicators can then vary depending on the local problems. So this is how my colleagues did it, but I can ask them in more detail, and yeah, we can talk about it later.
Thank you, Valentin. Is there any other additional comments from the audience? Please raise your hand. So since we've started, James also mentions the aspect of language, terminology, communication, science policy interface. I propose that we go to the topic of communications and learning on the bottom right. And I would like to invite Valentin maybe to provide a short comment on the inputs.
Yeah. So the communication is, of course, very much related to the accessibility. I think one common problem that I can also read out of a few post-its is that the results or the outputs are sometimes too scientific or sometimes not easily accessible for every stakeholder and every citizen. Of course, it depends a lot who the target group of the monitoring activity is, but in our case, it's also local businesses that work in the tourism industry and also citizens. So for us, it's important to also provide communication formats that can reach them in a better way. As I said, we had some problems about this in the past because we just wrote this really long report. But yeah, some people propose to use social media, podcasts, I can see. And then I also like this this idea of using citizen science methods. So I also attended a course on citizen science recently, and I think it's a good way to involve citizens in the science. It gives you the benefits to get some data that you are otherwise not so easily able to get, and it maybe it helps also giving citizens the like a view into your observatory, into your work, and it makes maybe your work more easily accessible to them. I don't know if the one who wrote this down has a concrete example of citizen science, how it can be used in those systems, or yeah. Otherwise, it's of course something interesting to think about.
So I don't know if someone wants to, the person who mentioned citizen science wants to say something additional. Of course, this also goes in line with what Julieta was telling us about the Andes and the increase of integrating participatory monitoring in the Andes. I see there is a comment by Angela Hoss. Would you like to raise your voice and tell us out loud?
Yes. Hello. Thanks. I'm the one that wrote the citizen science thing. I'm a mountain guide, and I'm looking for ways that mountain guides and our clients can become more engaged in supporting the work that scientists do. And as Valentin said, it would benefit the scientists as well as the citizens to get involved, to feel more of a connection to the work that you all are doing, to be able to actually contribute some data if there was some guidance into what types of things might be useful, because many of us as guides go to the same places seasonally where we work. And, myself, I've been on the same glaciers for over 30 years and seen significant changes. And I think there's just a lack of information of how to contribute and what could be useful that would further engage science with education and getting people more involved and interested in science and how that can influence policy and behavior. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I see that Jess, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
It's very interesting that you say that, Angela, because I recently heard about the province where I am in, which is the same as Valentin here in South Tyrol in northern Italy, is doing exactly that and is asking mountain guides to contribute data on the environmental changes that they're seeing. Because just as you say, the mountain guides are people that are going to these areas of mountains where maybe the normal people wouldn't be able to see these events happening if they're, particularly with glacial melt, but also with rock falls and things like that. So yeah, interesting that you said, but I didn't understand if you are already part of a project like that, or if you just noted that it would be something useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. That's great to know. I'll reach out to my Italian colleagues and learn more about what they're doing with that. Right now, I've just been engaging with a few folks that are doing citizen science projects with cloud formations and some perhaps observations of glaciers from taking photos from the exact same spot year after year that could contribute. But I think, there's just what my community needs is more ideas and support, like an actual project that would be easy to do. It's not heavy because we have to carry it, and it's something that's easy. It could be shared on social media or some simple app or platform. And I just know that there's a lot of interest in getting involved in these projects, but not much direction how or what to do.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation, and which also brings us to the importance of integrating not only natural and social sciences, but different types of knowledge. I remember one of the recommendations, I don't know if it was from Julieta or someone else, was the need for integrating local knowledge. And what you mentioned, Angela, about how to connect and to engage different actors, mountain guides, tourists, into these activities is important. And I think that's the perfect introduction to the fourth topic, which is the question of competences and resources. So I would like now to invite Virendra to comment on the ideas that were presented. Virendra, please.
Thank you. So I see just a couple of ideas that are relevant. I think one is related to communication, which I think has already been discussed earlier. Communication of monitoring results, specific skills and needs to be tailored. So is like, we all agree to this, because we need to also customize our information to the different messages to the different audiences, and need to customize. One question on how can coordination be resource efficient? I think this is very important, that coordination has to be there, because we have seen in our own experience, when we coordinate with other projects, for example, the forest fire monitoring system we are working on is just a part of the whole ecosystem, where we are dealing with the early warning as well as also the information on the fire incidences. But then there are other agencies who are working to build the capacities at the local level. So when you join hands together to organize the local level consultations or local level dissemination workshops, working together with them, showing our tools for information and how that information can be used to really take action in the ground. I think this kind of coordination really saves a lot of our resources and also makes it more synergistic when we go together. So I think in terms of resource mobilization, I think coordination becomes a quite important approach. And also on the measures could be long-term reflections. I think we all agree that with the kind of monitoring systems, we also get a better chance of understanding the patterns, both the spatial and the temporal patterns. This long-term information really gives us the better understanding, so that our strategy can be more focused. And for example, there was an insurance program for the forest fire. If anybody dies due to forest fire, then there's certain insurance policy brought up by the community forestry user groups. So with the kind of information we did, or kind of analysis we did, the most vulnerable municipalities or the districts or the communities, they can prioritize those areas for their insurance policies. So this sort of responses is possible when we have this monitoring system and also the analytics that provide the insights into our systems. So definitely it has to be long term, but again, before season is also quite important, because what we see is people forget very easily. And every year what we have seen, our experience is people start talking about forest fires only when the fires have already started. And then we already get the impacts or the effects of air pollution and all those. So doing the campaigns early on before the start of the season, I think is also quite important. So we need to have a long-term foresight, as well as also actions on time.
Thank you, Virendra. Does someone wants to add something or has an additional thought regarding what is the resources? If not, I may just jump on what you the last said about that important for long-term monitoring and long-term learning. And this reminds us of the question of for what, and of the comments that Daphna made at the beginning, right? For adaptive management, and how important it is to understand these dynamics over the longer term, to be able now to adapt to changes in mountains. So I will not summarize all of the wealth of ideas that were presented in this talk, but maybe just a few ideas on the four areas we've explored regarding data and knowledge. We mentioned the importance of further integrating socioeconomic with environmental, biophysical and environmental data, but also of bringing local level to the regional and global levels, and the challenge of having producing and disseminating knowledge which is relevant locally, but which can also be compared and used at the global level, regional and global level. Regarding accessibility of information, James made it very clear, and also the other panelists and participants, about the importance of open science, and that a lot of efforts should still remain to be done in this field of providing really freely shared and accessible data and knowledge, and some specific ideas of common databases and ways to do so. And then we spoke about communication and learning, and how to strengthen these science policy interfaces. I think with the talks, we also had some very good practical examples. I'm thinking of the fire detection monitoring system that Birendra presented, but also this sustainable tourism observatory presented by Valentin. Some successful examples of these science to policy interfaces, but further efforts are needed in these regards, and of course challenges in making sure that the data and the knowledge are actually presented in a way and in formats that are adapted to their audience. And last but not least, regarding competences and resources, all of the panelists highlighted the need for collaboration among diverse stakeholders, not only for the monitoring or observation activities themselves, but actually also for their implementation into actions. Some interesting thoughts also about participatory monitoring and citizen science and inclusion of local knowledge in these activities. So after this very rich overview, of course, in an hour and a half, we cannot explore as deep as we would like to all of these issues, but I think we have a lot of very interesting food for thought. I would like to let you know that the key insights of this talk will be summarized in a blog post, where we will also put the link to the recording of these presentations and to the resources that were provided by the panelists on the different studies and examples they provided. You will receive an email once this blog and all these resources are uploaded on our website, approximately in a couple of weeks. And I would like really to thank all of our panelists, all of our participants for this very rich discussion we had today. If I can have a very small request to you, once you close the meeting, you will be taken to a very short survey. If you could please just take a few minutes to fill this survey. These MRD talks is still a new format that we're piloting. This is our 5th experience, so we are eager on learning what was your experience and how we can improve the format. The next talk, MRD talk number 6, will be beginning of December, so please keep your eyes open on the website and social media. We will announce it. Thank you very much for your participation.